Euronews.
A rollercoaster week for the future of Ukraine and an EU-wide housing crisis that can no longer be ignored. Some of the stories shaping Brussels this week. Welcome to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon. For our fourth episode, I'm thrilled to be joined here in our studio by Seamus Boland, the brand new president of the European Economic and Social Committee, an EU institution that was set up back in the 50s to advise the EU on economic and social issues. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
We also have Shada Islam here with us in the studio, a well-known EU commentator and regular contributor to The Guardian, known, I was reading, as a key driver of Europe's political debates. Shada Islam, lovely to have you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
And welcome also to Petros Vassoulas, the Secretary General of the European Movement International. That was set up, I was reading, back in 1948 to promote democracy and European integration.
Good to be with you.
And you've been with them for 10 years now?
Indeed.
A familiar face as well in the Brussels circle. So lovely to have you all here with us. Seamus, you're the newbie in Brussels. How are you getting on? I mean, you've come from the Midlands of Ireland now to this fast-paced city. How's it all going?
The bogs of Ireland. I'm a bit like your man Hogan in the film, the Australian Longo. No, I know Brussels reasonably well. I'm a member of the committee since 2012. But yes, it's a very exciting position. As you know, the European Economic Social Committee, consisting of the workers, the trade unions, that is, and of course the employers and civil society. So our job is to try and come to compromises, get stuff passed to influence the Commission, to influence the Parliament. And we've been quite busy over the last few days and the last month since I've come into this position.
And you're a farmer originally. So you're bringing a bit of that kind of real life, on the ground experience to the job.
Absolutely. I'm born and reared in the Midlands, farming. A child of the 60s, I'm afraid. A lot of poverty in Ireland at that time. So I know a good deal about that. And my story is kind of well known in the sense that I left school at 13. And somehow they've trusted me with this position here in Brussels. But look, I spent my life working with people with disabilities, young people, disadvantaged, rural, urban disadvantage. So I do realise and know what civil society is about and the contribution it can make.
And this week, of course, you were down in Strasbourg. It was a busy week there. How have your weeks been, Shada?
Busy as well. And I have to say, just to Seamus, it's really important that our EU leadership has people like yourself there with a real life experience, can really speak truth to power. Because I think one of the things we've seen this week, whether you're covering Ukraine, Gaza, what was happening in Africa with the Africa Summit, the G20, Europe's role is there, but it's shaky at the moment. We're still struggling as Europeans to find our place in this complex multipolar world. So I've been busy, yeah.
Indeed. And you, Petros?
Trying to make sense of everything going on. And it's clear that the EU is finding itself at a crossroads. And we need to, first of all, define who we want to be and what our role should be in the world and how to promote our values. Because at the moment, they're under pressure, both from external actors, whether they're China, the US, but also internally. So it's a moment of reckoning for the EU as a whole.
A moment of reckoning for the EU as a whole. And that's why we're here on Brussels, my love, the podcast, trying to break it all down for you. Shada Islam, you mentioned Ukraine. And in fact, that's a story that we really need to discuss this week, given the flurry of diplomacy that we've seen in the last couple of days. It was a big topic as well in Strasbourg, with the Commission President alluding to the fact that now we have a good starting point, she said, Seamus Boland, when it came to these talks. But why is Ursula von der Leyen just calling it now a starting point? Surely the Europeans should be kind of driving these whole negotiations and not just observing. I'd
like to think they are. I've been in Ukraine, I think it was 2 years ago. I saw this sheer hardship and damage that was being done by this incredibly illegal war. I would like to think behind the scenes, given the original proposals put forward by the Trump administration, that Europe are actually in the middle of this discussions. I hope they are, because it has huge implications for Europe. A peace deal is fine. We want peace. We really need peace, and we need that war to stop too many people being killed. But we also need a peace that is lasting. And I think, in fairness to President von der Leyen, she is talking about the lasting peace. In other words, I think she said Russia invaded, 14 or 15 countries in the last few years, last century at least. We need to stop that too. EU, but Europe has a major stake in this.
Shada, and there's a feeling really that the Americans are trusting the Russians more than the Europeans here.
But is that a surprise? I mean, is that a surprise? Yes, it's a surprise because the US doing it, but Donald Trump is known for not really liking the European Union. He's made that very clear in the first term as well. And we should have been prepared for this. We should have been out there proactively, trying to sort of disengage a little bit with the US. But as we've seen on so many issues, and Teresa Ribera, the vice president, said it, there's been bullying and blackmail. We depend on the US for our security, and that hangs over us when we're talking about tech, trade, tariffs, everything. So I think this is a very, as you said, a moment of reckoning. This story is not just about Ukraine, it's also about our relationship with the US.
Because, of course, the blackmail, she was referring to the big talks here on Monday between the Europeans and the Americans. The first time they got together really to discuss trade since that big deal was clinched back in July. And I guess one of the reasons that Ursula von der Leyen signed up to that deal, Petros Vassoulis, back in July, she was appeasing the Americans in order to make sure they kind of stepped the line when it came to the future of Ukraine. But now you see the Europeans a little bit left out in the cold, not having a seat at the table.
Sometimes I think the EU plays with the rules of the old game. We haven't yet adapted to the new reality that the Trump style of foreign relations or transatlantic relations dictate. And we expect agreements to be kept, give and take, to eventually lead to a compromise. And that's not the way Donald Trump does politics. The interesting thing is, especially when it comes to the question of security in Europe and how to address Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that the EU seems to be united in purpose, but disunited structurally. Whereas we have, by and large, consensus that we need to take responsibility for our own security and we need to do everything necessary to protect Ukraine because our own safety depends on it, we don't have the necessary structures in place to enable us to take the difficult decisions. We unfortunately see much more infighting among institutions rather than promoting a common line with a voice that will enable us to persuade our adversaries.
Seamus, I know you're only 1 month in the job as president, but would you agree with that statement that you've just heard?
Yeah, I think the one point I would say, yes, you were absolutely right. There's a lot of institutional disagreement. But I did say in my inauguration speech, Europe is a very easy target to attack. 27 members, each with different views on the eastern flank, very much influenced by social media from Russia. And, there's a lot of criticism within and external. We're the easiest target. A dictatorship loves Europe to attack because they don't have to live by the same standards as we have. We have subsidiarity. We need countries to take their own views, etc. And because of that, we are structurally established in a very vulnerable way. And I think not enough defense of Europe as an ideal and the values it stands for is there. And I really called for that in my inauguration speech.
And we have disruptors within. If you look at the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban was planning to meet with Vladimir Putin this Friday in Moscow, Shad Islam.
No, absolutely. So you're right, Seamus, and obviously Petros, you as well. But I think there's something that we should not ignore, and you mentioned it. It's how our values and our democracy is being eroded from within. I've just written a piece for The Guardian in which I talk about that. Even mature democracies, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, all of these countries are actually attacking and violating some of our basic values in terms of human rights, the rights of migrants, the rights of marginalized communities. We're seeing a lot of disruption over Palestine, police violence against demonstrations, which are peaceful to start off with and then turn violent because there are clashes. So a lot of that is eroding our inner strength when we deal with countries like Russia and China, because they can turn to us and say, double standards. You're giving us moral lectures about how we should be behaving, but look at what's happening inside. So, Seamus, the values you talk about are so important that we keep them and consolidate them, reinforce them, and do not violate them when it's easy to do so.
It's worth pointing out that the European Union itself and the EU, the European continent at large, remains perhaps a safe haven for human rights, for the values that we consider essential to live a free and prosperous life. It is true that there are political movements within the EU, and unfortunately, often those movements are successful in pressuring governments in watering down or perhaps not taking the action necessary to defend those values. But still, the European Union remains a beacon of stability and inspiration for a lot of people around the world. The challenge for us is to do whatever is necessary to ensure that we do have the mechanisms to continue protecting those values and to remain strong advocates in favor of what the EU represents. And I think, Sada, you're absolutely right. We cannot let anybody off the hook when they're neglecting their duty to defend those very values.
Even though the big focus now, President Boland, is of course this transition from being a soft power to a military power. That is where the momentum is now in Brussels.
That is my real worry. And I put civil society at the heart of Europe in my inauguration as well. Let's be clear. Everyone understands that, and you're right, Shada, the reality is we're more on our own than we've ever been. We don't have this guaranteed big brother across the Atlantic supporting us in the same way they would have had before. That means we are forced into a militarization. Now, I ask the question, what are we defending? And do people in Europe understand what it is we're defending? And if you don't have civil society part of that defense discussion, and at the moment they're not. Civil society citizens do not know why we need all this militarization. You can have thousands of missiles, but if people themselves don't believe it, then you go nowhere. Ukraine lasting in this war because the people's spirit is still very high. If we were attacked, would the Europeans all unite against it? And they definitely won't if this militarization discussion happens without them. And there's a serious danger that's happening.
Interestingly enough, we did do an opinion poll this summer to ask exactly that question. And there's a very high level of support for the idea of common military cooperation at the European level. In fact, over 50% in the 7 countries we asked do believe that the idea of military cooperation at the European level is a good one. And of those 50%, 46% actually said they will even favor an EU army. So the realization of the challenges that we're facing and the necessary remedies to address those challenges, in effect, to protect our security, is there among the public, despite the fact that leaders haven't yet had that conversation with them. And I agree with you, we need to be upfront and we need to be honest about the need for us to pull together. Because fellow Europeans, just like they did in the 1940s when my organization was set up, are conscious of the need to pull together and stand together as Europeans.
And it's an interesting conversation now, especially as this idea of military conscription comes back. It's back on the table. We saw the speech as well from President Macron this week on that point, and also Germany is sending letters to young men, I believe, to encourage them to fight for their country, essentially, and potentially prepare for an invasion. I feel like we're talking about the Ukrainians without including them a lot in the conversation. So I did want to bring in now Sasha Vakalini. She's our Ukrainian correspondent, just for a feeling from Kyiv, really, on how they're perceiving the negotiations on the future of their country. Take a listen.
The most important thing for Ukrainians and for the authorities in Kyiv is to demonstrate first and foremost to the United States that it is not Ukraine that is being an obstacle to any sort of peace or ceasefire negotiations, that Ukraine is not objecting any of that, and Ukraine does want the settlement. Ukraine does want peace and wants truce as soon as possible. And this is why Kyiv authorities never rejected even the initial 28-point plan, no matter how unfavoring it was to Ukraine and no matter how it did not represent any of Kyiv's demands or the points where Kyiv could compromise upon. They just want to show that they are ready to negotiate and that they are in this process and they are willing to prove that they do want to have the truce and the ceasefire.
Sasha Vakalini there. And for more on that, do take a look at euronews.com. We also have an interview with Dmitry Kuleba. That's the Ukrainian politician who, of course, served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He spoke to Marit Gwynne-Jones, our reporter. So you can take a look at that on Euronews. But let's move on, because, of course, Ukraine is not the only topic on our listeners' minds, but the EU housing crisis. In the room here, you all know the facts. Between 2015 and 2024, the house prices rose in the EU by 53%. This is astonishing, and it's a huge problem, especially in countries like your own, in Ireland.
In Ireland, it's a pandemic, it's an epidemic, call it what you like. Look, the reality is young people, and I heard this morning, people calling themselves young at 46 don't have a house. Imagine.
Wow.
Now, the problem with that is you're heading into older age, living in unsecure rented accommodation, and you are destined for poverty. And that's a major, major issue. And we need to state this as an emergency, because that would help fast tracking the legislation that's needed. The emergency means that, imagine coming to a 35-year-old, which is not that young a person, a lot younger than me, but and saying, we are giving you a 25-year plan for housing. Come on. Give us a break. That's not a.
I've been in Brussels for years as a reporter. Housing was never on the topic of politicians or EU leaders at a summit until very recently, with Antonio Costa bringing it up.
We met him. We met Mr. Costa, and he was very clear. He's very refreshing.
The President of the Council.
He really, the President of the Council of Europe. He's really on the same track. We need to really deal with this as an emergency. Otherwise, we will baffle and waffle and talk lots of nonsense about figures and what we can't and what we can't do because of regulation. This is an emergency, and we need to deal with it in that way.
Baffle and waffle, that's the perfect description. And I think people are absolutely fed up of the baffle and waffle coming out of Brussels, Shada Islam. But really, is there anything that the EU can actually do? I mean, they have this task force. It's been run now by Eamon Ryan, former minister in Ireland.
No, that's good. But, Seamus, you're absolutely right. I think it's part of a wider problem, and it links a little bit to what we were discussing before. We're living in a moment where we're creating a sense of fear in Europe, right? So all this talk of security, army, of course, Russia, all of this is valid. But I think what people need, young people need, is hope and something to look forward to. And I think that is where our politicians at the moment, I'm very critical, are not giving us hope. Those who do, looking to the other side of the Atlantic, Zoran Mamdani, or even here, Rob Shetton in the Netherlands, or Catherine Connolly, Zach Polanski in the UK, Pedro Sanchez sometimes. These people are giving a sense of hope. And without that, we're going to see the ascendance of the far right. I'll just say to you, just recently, this week, really, I followed it, at the G20, South Africa took a very bold decision to set up an emergency question on inequality. That is part of the housing problem, the affordability, the insecurity of housing, especially for young people. Inequality is behind a lot of the problems we have at the moment in terms of racism, marginalization, stigmatization of minorities. Inequality, I think, is the big issue, and housing is very much part of it. Some people can afford it. People who work at the European institutions are sure do not have a problem, but we see it every day in our neighborhoods. This is a huge problem of homelessness as well. And as I said again, I wish when we talk about housing, we do not forget the most marginalized in Europe as well. There's a real crisis there, including racism.
We talked about the vulnerability of Europe, and I think the economic situation a lot of people find themselves in is at the heart of that vulnerability, both because we feel vulnerable ourselves in that sense of insecurity, economic insecurity, but also because it creates fertile ground for that external manipulation of our current predicament. And obviously, this is where a lot of our energy should go to address the inequalities we talked about, to give people hope and perspective, to enable them to make the most of what a rich continent can actually offer. And until we do that, we will remain vulnerable. Now, the problem is that the EU itself doesn't really have the powers, the authority to provide the solutions that the people are craving for. Issues like housing are very much at the hand of national politicians, of member states, as we call them here in Brussels. And until the EU is enabled, empowered to provide those solutions, unfortunately, it will be blamed for not doing something in an area that is not able to do something.
I think you're absolutely right, but I think Europe needs to give some leadership. And in fairness to Mr. Costa, President of the European Council, he is trying to do that. The reality is young people, everybody's worrying about, young people are going to the far right, are going to some extremism. They're not. They're looking for somebody to deliver a problem, a solution to a problem that they are now experiencing on a daily basis. Now, if at least the EU should give the leadership, okay, you're right, individual countries do have the power. That's the way this goes back to my original point, the way Europe is designed. It's designed to be like that. Unfortunately, that means Europe, as you said, Shana, is not exactly on everything. But for heaven's sake, we need to give leadership. We need to say to young people, we hear you, we understand the problems, and instead of allowing the others and the extreme to get in there and offer, frankly, no solutions, just poor disinformation and social lies as a solution, we need to come and do it, because we're supposed to be in the place to do it. So.
Petros, you've been 10 years at the European Movement International. Who could be that leader?
I do believe that there is ample talent across Europe to provide that leadership. The structures, though, are not there. You could have perhaps the incoming Prime Minister of the Netherlands, a young man full of great ideas, that vision of hope. Is he, though, able to lead in an organization, in a set of institutions that are designed in a way that doesn't let anybody in particular lead? Can we restructure perhaps our own union to make sure that it does provide the platform and the opportunity for those visionary leaders to come forward? We've had vision from leaders before, but they were unable, maybe unwilling, to deliver on that vision because it was difficult, because the circumstances didn't allow it. So, when we look around, we shouldn't just look at individuals. There's so much talent and idea in civil society, in academia, in politics, in the media, where, we have it. There. The leadership is there, is all among us. But unfortunately, what the EU is lacking is that way, that elevator that will bring those ideas to the fore, inspire people to follow that leader, and so they can deliver.
And that hope, as Shada said, right?
But that's an asset. I think everything you've said, Petros and Seamus, is an asset for Europe. And that is why, we are not, the beacon that the world needs at the moment. I think there is a lot of admiration for how far Europe has come. I'm speaking to people across the world practically every day as part of my job. I want to know what real people are thinking. And there is admiration. There was inspiration. Some of our leaders were really inspiring in the past. And what we're seeing now is a very messy Europe, a Europe that's not sure of itself and whose leaders are, instead of uniting people across the continent on a cause of perspective, of hope, are disuniting people, actually feeding the hate that is, in society that sometimes, because of the inequalities and the austerity we've lived through. So the leader that brings people together rather than separates them, and I'm seeing this across the European Union, Maeve. So many leaders, when they see a fight or when they see inequality, they see racism, make it worse rather than bringing people together. And I think that's a huge weakness.
Seamus, I'll leave the final word for you because you are a leader. You are the president, the brand new president. You have 2.5 years now to make some change.
Yeah.
What do you hope to get done?
I'm quite happy to volunteer to be that leader, but let's be clear. Look, in the ESC, we're very clear. We have put housing as a major issue. We're now talking to Mr. Costa. We will again. We are simply saying, call it. Call it for what it is. Young people know what it is. It's an emergency. If in an emergency that it says, and it puts the challenge up to each individual country, get your house in order. Put the emergency legislation in place to deal with this. Because if you do not deal with this in the next 5 years, Europe, as Shada and Petros, is going to be in trouble. We will not be believed, and those in the popular side of things, the populist side of things, will really take over. They won't have solutions either, but they will take the chance. So leadership is now, and we should do it now.
Okay, and on that point, we can bring the conversation to an end. Thank you so much to our guest, President Seamus Boland, for being with us, to Shada Islam for being with us, and also, of course, to Petros Vassoulas. Do let us know what you thought. You can reach out to us on brusselsmylove@euronews.com. Thank you also to those behind the scenes, our sound technician, Georgios Slaviditis, our Euronews podcast producer, Alice Carnevali, and to Fatih Yetim and Juliana Mejia, our social media team. And if you're not already, you can listen to this series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on euronews.com or the Euronews YouTube channel. And do, as I said, leave us a review and spread the word about Brussels, My Love, the podcast. See you next time.